my fellow odd ones. Welcome to the very first episode of MysHistory, where we'll discuss odd, unsolved, and some forgotten historical mysteries. In case you're not familiar, I'm Rhonda. I'm not in my kitchen. I live in the southwestern part of the United States. It's quite warm. A little warm for baking in the afternoon. I knew that there would be topics that I wanted to talk about that would require me to be more engaged with you guys, that took maybe a little bit more research, and that I wanted to be able to delve into and talk about without being distracted by baking. I love a good mystery. I love history. So why not marry those two together? And that's where MysHistory came up. If this sounds like something that you might also enjoy, then please consider subscribing. This is a topic that my son suggested, as it's going to be alluded to in a show called Loki. He thought it would be interesting to tie something on my little channel to that show. So, let's talk about the mysterious and unsolved case of D.B. Cooper. This case dates back to November 24th, 1971 in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. It was the afternoon before Thanksgiving when a man calling himself Dan Cooper walked up to the ticket counter of Northwest Orient Airlines in Portland, Oregon. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington on flight 305, paying in cash. The cost of the ticket was $20. He was described as being a nondescript man, wearing a suit with a black tie and a white shirt. He carried an attaché case. He appeared to be in his mid-40s and was in general just like any other passenger boarding that day. Side note, flying back in the days before 9/11 was much different. There was a security checkpoint, but you didn't need a boarding pass to get through security. They weren't checking your ID against your boarding pass to make sure that you were who you said you were going to board the plane. This allowed for family and friends to see you off at the gate. And if you've ever watched older TV shows, you see people even meeting their family or friends at the gate. It wasn't uncommon for people to give their boarding passes and tickets to somebody else when they couldn't make a flight. All you needed to get on the plane was a boarding pass. You also did not need to show up an hour or more before your flight because security was not at all like it has been in the days since 9/11. As the story goes, Dan Cooper entered the airport in Portland at around 4 p.m. He purchased his ticket for the 4:35 p.m. flight. He was assigned to an aisle seat, 18C. There were 36 other passengers also aboard the plane, along with the pilot, the first officer, a flight engineer, and two flight attendants, Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner. He boarded the plane and ordered a bourbon and soda while waiting for the flight to take off. Shortly after the flight took off from Portland, Mr. Cooper handed flight attendant Florence Schaffner a note. Back in those days, it was not uncommon for men who were traveling alone to slip their phone numbers or their hotel room numbers to flight attendants. So, Miss Schaffner simply placed the paper in her pocket and went about her duties. When she passed by Mr. Cooper again, he motioned for her to come closer and said that she better read the note, and then said that he had a bomb in his case. Miss Schaffner went to the galley. She read the note. She showed it to the other flight attendant, Tina Mucklow. The two of them then entered the cockpit to show the pilot. Upon reading the note, the pilot, well, he contacted air traffic. They contacted the Seattle police, who then contacted the FBI. The FBI then made an urgent phone call to the president of the airline, Donald Nyrop, who stated that they should comply with the demands set forth by Mr. Cooper in his letter, probably in order to avoid negative publicity. Mr. Cooper then instructed Ms. Schaffner to return his note to him, which he took, likely to avoid any incriminating evidence against him. According to Ms. Schaffner, the note was handwritten, and he demanded $200,000 in cash along with 2 sets of parachutes. He demanded that these items be delivered to the Seattle-Tacoma airport and stated that should his demands not be met, he would blow up the plane. It has also been reported that according to those on the flight who did read the note, it contained the phrase, "No funny business." Cooper then demanded Ms. Schaffner sit next to him. He slid over to the window seat and she then occupied his aisle seat. He opened his case, revealing a glimpse of 2 cylinders and a mess of wires. He then instructed her to return to the cockpit and tell the pilot to remain in the air until the money and the parachutes were ready. To the pilot's credit, he made the announcement that they would be circling the jet above Seattle prior to landing due to mechanical problems. Thus, most of the people aboard Flight 305 had no idea that the flight had been hijacked. It is believed that due to how precise Mr. Cooper was about the money, he had done his research. He demanded that the $200,000 be in all $20 bills, as they would likely weigh around 21 pounds. Smaller bills would weigh more, and while larger bills would weigh less, they would be a little more difficult to pass. He further specified that he wanted bills with random serial numbers and not sequential. The FBI did give random serial numbers per the demand, but they made sure that every single bill started with the letter L. The parachutes, however, proved to be a little more difficult to obtain than the money. McCord Air Force Base in Tacoma offered to provide parachutes, but Mr. Cooper rejected the offer because he wanted civilian parachutes with user-operated ripcords. Seattle police were able to contact the owner of a skydiving school, and then they persuaded him to sell them 4 parachutes. It was initially believed that Cooper wanted the extra parachutes in order to take hostages, and so the FBI considered using a dummy parachute for the exchange, and then they opted not to, as they didn't want to risk the life of a civilian. Around 5:24 that evening, the ground team in Seattle radioed the pilot and informed him that they were ready for the plane to land. Cooper, in charge the whole time from seat 18C, ordered that they taxi to a remote, well-lit area on the runway and then had the cabin lights dimmed. He further ordered that no vehicles should approach the plane and stated that the individual bringing the ransom should come alone. An employee for Northwest Orient drove a company vehicle near the plane, and Mr. Cooper ordered flight attendant Tina Mucklow to lower the stairs. The employee carried only 2 parachutes at a time to the stairs and handed those to Ms. Mucklow. He then brought the money in a large bank bag. After reviewing that his demands had been met, Mr. Cooper released the 36 passengers along with flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Tina Mucklow and the other 3 members of the flight crew remained on the plane. At some point in all of this going on, an FAA official contacted the pilot asking for permission from Mr. Cooper to come aboard. His request was obviously denied by Mr. Cooper. We're all shocked. It is believed that Mr. Cooper chose that specific flight because it was a Boeing 727-100, and he appeared to know quite a bit about that type of jet. Once all of the passengers and Miss Schaffner were off of the plane, Mr. Cooper made Ms. Mucklow read over the instructions for the operation of the aft stairs. He asked if they could be lowered during flight, and she said that she didn't think so. He then informed her that she was wrong. It was after this incident that the Boeing 727-100 had a design change in the aft stairs. Mr. Cooper told the crew that he wanted to go to Mexico City. He demanded that the pilot remain at an altitude of 10,000 feet and keep the airspeed below 150 knots. The pilot explained that while the altitude and speed Mr. Cooper wanted was doable for that particular jet, it wouldn't be able to travel more than 1,000 miles without refueling, even with 52,000 gallons of fuel. It was agreed that the plane would land in Reno, refuel there. So, Cooper further demanded that the flight be refueled before leaving Seattle. He apparently knew that this particular jet could take 4,000 gallons of fuel per minute. So when they weren't done refueling the plane after 15 minutes, he demanded an explanation. There doesn't seem to be a reported explanation, but I'm sure we can all kind of come to the conclusion that they were trying to do some funny business. And when Cooper caught on, they completed the job so as not to cost any lives of the 4 remaining crew members aboard the plane. Prior to takeoff, the pilot and Mr. Cooper agreed upon a low altitude route from Seattle to Reno, Nevada, known as Vector 23, which would allow the jet to fly safely west of the Cascades. Cooper further directed the captain to depressurize the cabin, as he knew you can breathe normally at 10,000 feet. And that should the cabin have equalized pressure inside and out, there wouldn't be a violent gust of wind when the aft stairs were lowered. The plane took off at 7:46 p.m. from Seattle, and Mr. Cooper ordered the remaining crew members to stay in the cockpit until they landed in Reno. There was no peephole in the door, so no one was able to see what he was doing, and there were also no remote cameras in the cabin at that time. Around 8 p.m., a red light in the cockpit warned that a door was open, prompting the pilot to get on the intercom and ask Mr. Cooper if there was anything they could do for him. Mr. Cooper simply responded with an angry "No." This would be the last word that anyone ever heard from the mystery man. At around 8:24 p.m., 25 miles north of Portland, near the Lewis River, the pilot noted that the jet genuflected, with the nose dipping first, followed by a correcting dip at the tail. In the cockpit, the crew assumed that Cooper had lowered the aft stairs and jumped, but they weren't sure, as none of them dared to leave the cabin for fear of what might happen if they disobeyed his orders. The flight landed safely in Reno at 10:15 p.m. It was at this time the pilot again spoke over the intercom to Cooper. After receiving no response, he opened the cockpit door and noted that Mr. Cooper, his belongings, and the money were gone. The only item that was left aboard the aircraft was the second parachute. Dan Cooper was never heard from again. Investigations since that night have been unable to prove whether or not Cooper survived his jump. The police did attempt to follow the plane to wait to see if someone would jump, because they did think that that's something that might happen. Originally, they wanted to use an F-106 fighter jet, but those planes were no good at lower speeds. They were able to get a Lockheed T-33 secured from the Air National Guard, but before they were able to catch up with Flight 305, Mr. Cooper had already jumped. The parachutes he used couldn't be steered. His clothing and footwear were unsuitable for a rough landing, and he jumped into a densely wooded area at night. Inclement weather that night meant the police had to delay searching the area until the next day, which was Thanksgiving. That Thanksgiving and for several weeks following, police did an extensive search. This resulted in no trace of a parachute, the money, or Dan Cooper. Police then started to do criminal record search for the name Dan Cooper, which would also be another dead end. This did lead, though, to a police record for a man in Oregon named D.B. Cooper, who would be considered a possible suspect. He was quickly cleared, but a member of the media who really just wanted to get the first scoop out there confused that man's name for the alias given by the hijacker. This would be repeated by another reporter, and so on, like a wild game of telephone, and the entire media used the name DB, and so Dan just disappeared for the remainder of the investigation. In 1976, charges for air piracy were filed against Dan Cooper, and they still stand today. On February 10th, 1980, an 8-year-old boy found bundles of $20 bills with serial numbers matching those of the Cooper case near the Columbia River, leading people to believe that he did not survive his jump that November night. This would lead to new searches around the area. However, the eruption of Mount St. Helens on May 18th most likely destroyed any remaining clues. More than 800 suspects were considered, but by the 5-year anniversary, all but 24 were eliminated from consideration. People have come out and confessed to being Dan Cooper. The FBI checks the fingerprints of these confessors to the prints that they collected from the plane, and as of today, they have yet to have a match. In July of 2016, the FBI made the announcement that they would no longer be allocating active resources to continuing the investigation of D.B. Cooper. Though they haven't solved the case, the leading theory is that he did not survive his jump. Though they initially thought he may have been a professional skydiver, they've concluded that a jump in those weather conditions that November night over that part of Washington state, wearing business casual attire, would have been a risk that no expert would have been willing to take. The fact that some of the matching ransom money was found further supports this theory. In August of 2020, an amateur scientist used an electron microscope to identify diatoms on the money that was found in 1980. This was found buried just beneath the sand on the bank of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He examined the bills in 2008 per the request of the Seattle FBI, and he just recently turned his attention to the diatoms, or algae, in 2020. He wondered if they could use different species of diatoms on the Cooper money to determine when the money got wet and then landed on the banks of the Columbia River. It was concluded that the diatoms found on the money were a spring species and did not bloom in November, when Cooper jumped that November night of 1971. The information then puts into question the FBI's theory that in the 1980s the money floated down from wherever it was believed that Cooper landed near Lake Merwin in southwest Washington, leading the money to flow into the Washougal River and eventually into the Columbia. This has then led to more questions than answers, as they then wonder how the money ended up in the water so many years after the jump, and some 18 miles away from where it was suspected that he jumped. I know that's quite a bit of information I've put out in a very short amount of time, but let's continue the conversation in the comments. Have you heard of this case? I'd be hard-pressed to think that you hadn't. Do you have any theories on what happened to the mystery man who called himself Dan Cooper? Is it possible that he jumped elsewhere in the flight and not at that suspected drop zone near Lake Merwin when the pilot noted that dip? How do you explain some of that money showing up on the banks of the Columbia River some 9 years after his jump? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and hit that bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. I will see you soon. Bye.